The Kelvori homeworld was a quiet place. It had always been quiet. The Kelvori were not a loud people. They did not build massive cities that scraped the clouds. They did not launch 1,000 warships into the stars to show off their power. They were small in number, gentle in nature, and they lived on a warm green planet called Kelvori Prime, deep inside a system of 4 moons that turned slowly around their amber sun. For 200 years, they had been part of the Galactic sovereignty. That was the name of the great alliance of species that governed most of the known galaxy. It had hundreds of members, empires, federations, collectives, all bound together by treaties and agreements that had taken centuries to build. The sovereignty had its own council, its own laws, its own fleets. It was supposed to protect its members. The Kelvori had always believed that. They believed it right up until the day the Volkai came. The Volkai Dominion was not a new enemy. They had been known to the galaxy for almost a century. They were large, powerful, and they were cruel in a very organized way. They did not attack out of anger or madness. They attacked because they calculated that they could win, and winning was what they did. One by one, over 30 years, they had consumed 12 civilizations. Some fought back, some ran, some tried to negotiate. It did not matter. The Volkai always came, and the Volkai always won. When their fleet crossed into the Kelvori system, there was no warning, no message, no demand. Just ships, hundreds of them, appearing at the edge of sensor range like a dark wall moving through the stars. Elder Sathrek was the first official to be told. He was an old Kelvori with deep green scales and eyes the color of pale gold. He had spent most of his long life in service to his people. He had attended sovereignty meetings. He had signed treaties. He had shaken hands, or the Kelvori equivalent of it, with beings from 100 different worlds. He had truly believed, that the sovereignty was a structure worth trusting. When the young soldier brought him the sensor report and placed it on the table in front of him, Sathrek sat very still for a long time. He read the numbers: 340 Volkai warships, moving at a steady pace, aimed directly at Kelvori Prime. He did not panic. He was too old for panic. He picked up the communication line and called the Sovereignty Council. The line connected after a short wait. A smooth, artificial voice informed him that the council was in session and could not be interrupted. He left a message. Then he sent an emergency transmission, a priority signal that was supposed to bypass all normal channels and reach the council's emergency desk immediately. He received an automated reply. His transmission had been received. Someone would respond within 48 hours. 48 hours. The Volkai fleet would reach Kelvori Prime in 31. Sathrek closed his eyes. He breathed slowly. Then he stood up, straightened his robes, and walked to the communications tower at the center of the capital. The tower was an old building. It had been built long before the sovereignty, back when the Kelvori were just beginning to reach beyond their own moons. It had tall walls and wide windows, and from the top floor, you could see almost the entire capital city. The low curved buildings, the long green fields at the edges of town, the rivers that caught the amber light of the sun and turned it to something almost gold. Sathrek looked at his city for a moment. Then he went inside and told the communications team what he needed. He needed to broadcast a distress signal, not just to the sovereignty, to everyone. A wideband transmission on every known frequency, aimed in every direction, carrying a simple message. The Kelvori were under attack. They were a peaceful people. They had done nothing wrong. They needed help. The team worked through the night. They built the signal. They aimed it at every major civilization they had contact information for: the Threnai Empire, the Asavari Collective, the Mulran Federation, the Dureshi Commonwealth, dozens of others. They sent it just before dawn. Then they waited. Velnoma was not an important person. She was aware of this. She worked a mid-level communications desk at a sovereignty relay station that nobody had a strong reason to visit. The station sat at the edge of a quiet sector, mostly processing routine trading notifications and the occasional scientific report. It was not exciting work. It was steady, organized work, and Vel Noma was a steady, organized person. She was a Lasari, a species with thin gray skin, 4 long fingers on each hand, and large dark eyes built for reading screens in low light. She had been working this desk for 6 years. She was good at her job in the way that very careful people are good at quiet jobs. She noticed things, small things. She filed everything neatly. She never ignored a signal just because it looked unimportant. The Kelvori distress transmission reached her station 11 minutes after it was sent. Vel Noma flagged it immediately. She pulled up the full message. She read it 3 times. Then she reached for the emergency routing console and began forwarding it to the Council's active attention queue. Not the normal queue, not the 48-hour queue, but the one reserved for genuine crises. The system rejected her request. She blinked. She tried again. The system told her that the Kelvori distress signal had already been received and logged by the Council, and that the matter was under review. Under review. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the signal again. She looked at the coordinates. She looked at the number of Volkai ships. She pulled up the Sovereignty's response database, the log of all active emergency requests and their current status. The Kelvori signal was there. Its status read, pending assessment, secondary priority. Secondary priority. Vel Noma stared at that for a long time. She had been working at this desk for 6 years. She had seen how the Council moved. She had seen what pending assessment meant in real terms. It meant that someone somewhere had looked at the Kelvori's situation and decided that the political cost of responding was higher than the political cost of doing nothing. It meant that behind closed doors, in quiet rooms, powerful beings were already calculating whether the Kelvori were worth the trouble. She already knew the answer they were going to arrive at. Because she had seen this before, not with the Kelvori, but with others. She turned back to her screens. The distress signal was still going out. It was broadcasting in every direction, carrying its message into the dark between stars. And as she watched the logs update in real time, she began to see the responses, or rather, the lack of them. The Threnai Empire acknowledged receipt of the signal. They expressed deep concern. They would raise the matter at the next full council assembly, scheduled in 9 days. 9 days. The Asavari Collective sent a formal note expressing their sympathy for the Kelvori people and their strong belief that diplomatic channels should be exhausted before any military consideration was made. The Mulran Federation did not respond at all. One by one, the great powers of the sovereignty went quiet. Some sent polite words, some sent nothing. Not one of them sent ships. Vel Noma watched the responses come in and not come in, and she felt something she did not have a precise word for. It was not quite anger. It was not quite sadness. It was the feeling of watching something you always feared was true become true in front of your eyes. She leaned forward and began closing the active monitoring windows one by one. There was no point watching anymore. The signal was dying in the dark. She had her job to finish. She would file the logs, mark the responses, and close out the relay window before the end of her shift. She reached for the last window, the one that was still showing the raw incoming data from the signal's broadcast, and her finger stopped. There was something there. A small entry, almost invisible in the stream of data, an automated acknowledgement ping not from any sovereignty member, not from any known major civilization. It came from a direction that, when she checked against her charts, pointed toward a region of space that was mostly empty on the official maps. Low development space, the outer edge of the Orion Arm. She almost closed it. It was probably a relay echo. Those happen sometimes, a signal bouncing off a station and coming back looking like a new response. Then she saw the timestamp. The acknowledgement had come back in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Velnoma went very still. She knew the distances. She had been working with signal times and distances for 6 years. Whatever had sent that ping was not a relay echo. It was not a passive bounce off some dead station. Something had received the Kelvori signal. Something had read it. And something had sent back a confirmation, not a polite note, not a diplomatic reply, not a promise to discuss the matter, just a clean, direct acknowledgement that said, in the simple language of deep space communications, message received, understood, acting. Acting. That one word made her hands stop moving. She pulled the ping source data and ran it through her location charts. The coordinates resolved slowly, overlapping with sparse old survey files from about 40 years ago. A small system, one inhabited planet, a species that the sovereignty had cataloged briefly and mostly ignored. They had been given a standard file, young civilization, early spaceflight, not yet considered significant. The species was called human. The planet was called Earth. Velnoma had never spoken to a human. She had barely read the sovereignty file on them. Nobody paid much attention to Earth. They were a new species, only 80 years into real space travel. They had a handful of colony ships, a few research stations, some small defense vessels. They were considered a minor presence. Background noise. She read the acknowledgement ping again. Then she ran a calculation. If something had already turned around and started moving toward the Kelvori system at the moment the ping was sent, how long would it take to arrive? The number on her screen made her blink. She ran it again. Same number. She sat very quietly in her low-lit station, in a part of the galaxy that nobody particularly cared about, and she looked at that number, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something shift inside her chest. She did not close the window. Back on Kelvori Prime, the hours moved slowly and heavily. The planetary defense forces, small, under-equipped, designed for border incidents rather than full invasions, were doing what they could. Every ship that could fly was being armed. Every ground installation was powered up. Sathrek had ordered the civilian population away from the coastal cities and into the inland shelters. It was not enough. Everyone knew it was not enough. But they did it anyway, because doing something was better than standing still. The soldiers were young. Most of them had never seen real combat. They moved through their duties with a kind of quiet determination that Sathrek found both admirable and heartbreaking. They checked their equipment. They ran their drills. They did not talk much. Sathrek walked among them sometimes in the long hours before the Vokai arrived. He did not have inspiring speeches to give. He was not that kind of leader. He walked, and he looked at his people, and he felt the full weight of what was coming. He had received the sovereignty's response by now, the careful language, the deep concern, the promise of review. He had read it once and put it away and not looked at it again. He had also received the logs from the communications tower. He had seen the tally of responses from across the galaxy. He was not surprised. He was old enough to not be surprised by this kind of thing anymore. He had always known, somewhere deep and quiet inside him, that when it came to it, the great powers would weigh the cost and find it too high. What surprised him, what he thought about as he stood at the tower window looking out at the amber evening light, was the one small ping that had come back from a direction nobody expected. His communications officer had shown it to him. She was young, barely out of training, and she had looked at Sathrek with wide gold eyes as she explained what the ping meant. He had listened without expression. When she finished, he asked her to show him the coordinates. He looked at the coordinates for a long time. Earth, he had heard the name distantly, the way you hear the name of a small town far away that you have no reason to visit. A young species, new to the stars, not significant according to everyone who had an opinion on such things. They had answered in 4 minutes. Not with words, not with diplomatic language, with a moving ship. Sathrek turned away from the window. He walked back to his desk and sat down. Outside, the sun was going down behind the four moons, and the sky was turning from amber to deep purple, and somewhere out in the dark, 340 Volkai warships were drawing closer with every passing minute. He thought about Earth, about a species he had never met, moving through the dark toward a world they had no reason to care about. He did not know why they were coming. He did not know what they could possibly do when they got here. He did not know if it would matter. But they had answered. In the quiet of his office, with the weight of everything pressing down on him, Elder Sathrek allowed himself one small, private feeling. It was not hope. It was something quieter than hope. It was the feeling of not being completely alone in the dark. He sat with that feeling for a little while. Then he got back to work. Outside, the last light faded from the sky over Kelvori Prime, and the stars came out one by one, cold and bright and very far away. Somewhere among them, something was moving, something that had not been asked to come, something that had received a signal and without discussion, without calculation, without asking what it would cost, had simply turned around and started moving toward the sound of someone calling for help. The night settled over the capital city. The soldiers kept their watch. The shelters filled with families who held their children close and spoke in quiet voices. The amber moon rose over the eastern hills and cast long shadows across the empty streets. And the signal went on broadcasting into the dark, over and over, carrying its simple message to anyone who would listen. Most of the galaxy had already decided not to. But somewhere far away, at the edge of the Orion Arm, a fleet was moving through the night between stars, and it was moving fast. The signal reached Geneva at 3:40 hours. Most of the city was asleep. The streets were quiet. The lake sat still and dark under a cloudy sky. The lights of the United Nations Defense Command building were the only bright thing on the waterfront at that hour. They were always on, always bright, because the people who worked inside them had long ago accepted that trouble does not keep regular hours. Admiral Seraphine Akafer was in the middle of a briefing when the duty officer knocked and opened the door. She was a tall woman, not tall in a way that announced itself, just tall and straight and steady, the way old trees are steady. Her hair was cut short and going gray at the edges. She wore her uniform the way she wore everything, without thinking about it, because it had been part of her life for so long it was just her skin now. Her eyes were dark brown and very clear, and when she looked at you, you had the feeling she was reading something behind your face that you did not know was written there. She had been up since 200. That was normal. The duty officer handed her a printed transcript of the signal. She read it while the other people in the room waited. She read it the way she read everything, carefully, completely, without rushing. When she reached the end, she went back and read the part about the Volkai fleet again. Then she set the paper down on the table and looked at the duty officer. "Who else has it?" she asked. "Everyone," the officer said. "It's a wideband broadcast. The whole galaxy has it." "Who's responded?" The officer's mouth pressed into a thin line. "The Sovereignty is reviewing it. The Thren I sent a note. Nobody's moving." Akafer nodded once. She looked at the paper again. She looked at the coordinates. She did the math in her head. Then she stood up. "Get me the authorization codes," she said, "and wake up the fleet commanders." The briefing room went very quiet for a moment, not because people were afraid, because people were listening to the sound of something beginning. "Admiral," said one of the senior officers at the table, a man named General Foss, broad-shouldered, careful, the kind of person who liked to be sure about things before he moved. "We don't have a sovereignty mandate for this. The Kelvori aren't under our protection, legally speaking." "Legally speaking, 12 civilizations are gone," Akafer said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And the 13th is asking for help. I'm going to give it to them." General Foss looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and reached for his communication device. Within 20 minutes, the building was fully awake. The UES Unbroken Promise was the largest warship Earth had ever built. It was not large the way some alien ships were large, not designed to be impressive from a distance, not built with grand curves and ornamental structures meant to signal power to other civilizations. It was large the way a working tool is large, because the job required it. Every part of it had a purpose. Every piece of its hull plating was there for a reason. It was a ship that had been built by people who understood war and were not romantic about it. Commander Darius Solano was in the middle of a training exercise when the order came through. He was in the tactical simulation room on Deck 7, working through a multi-vector defense problem with his team. He was 38 years old, dark-skinned, with a permanent small frown that was not unfriendliness but concentration, the expression of a man who was always thinking about the next problem before the current one was finished. He was very good at his job. His job was figuring out how to win fights, and he had a talent for it that went beyond training. He thought sideways. He saw angles that other tacticians missed. His teams sometimes found him frustrating to work with, because he would make a decision that looked strange, and 3 steps later it would become obvious and brilliant. When the order came through, he read it, turned to his team and said, "Pack it up, we have a real one." Nobody asked questions, they packed it up. Dr. Yumiko Hara was in her quarters reading when she received her notification. She was the ship's head of xenodiplomacy, the person responsible for communicating with alien civilizations, understanding their cultures, finding the words that built bridges instead of walls. She was a small woman with a calm face and very precise hands, and she read twice as fast as most people and forgot almost nothing. She read her notification. Then she pulled up everything in the ship's database on the Kelvori. It was not a lot. The sovereignty's file on them was thin. She read it in 20 minutes and thought about it for another 10. Then she got dressed and went to work. Chief Engineer Bram Osai was already in the engine room when the order came through. This was not unusual. Bram was almost always in the engine room. He was a heavy man, not fat but dense, as if he had been built more solidly than other people. He had enormous hands that were always slightly dirty and a slow, quiet way of speaking that made people assume he was slow and quiet in his thinking too. He was not. He was one of the fastest problem solvers on the ship. He just did not feel the need to announce it. He read the order. He nodded to himself. He called his team together and told them they were moving on emergency deployment, that the drives needed to be at full readiness in 3 hours, and that anyone who needed sleep should get it now because they were not going to get much once they were underway. Then he went back to what he had been doing, which was fixing a small seal on an auxiliary power conduit that nobody else had noticed was showing early wear. He fixed it quietly and thoroughly and moved on to the next thing. The fleet assembled in the dark. Not just the Unbroken Promise, 487 ships in total, gathering from across the solar system and the near colonies. Carriers, dreadnoughts, destroyers, frigates, fast-response gunships that could cross a combat zone in seconds and hit hard before anyone had time to react. Supply ships, medical transports. Ships designed for functions that most other civilizations had not yet thought of, because humans had a way of building solutions to problems before the problems fully arrived. The gathering took 6 hours. To an outside observer, to someone watching from the sovereignty's relay stations, for example, it must have looked strange. A species that the galaxy barely paid attention to, mobilizing their entire military presence and pointing it toward a conflict that had nothing to do with them, in a star system they had no official interest in, for a people they had barely met. It would have looked strange, yes, but the crews of those 487 ships would not have found it strange at all, because they knew the story. Most of them had grown up with it. It was not a famous story in the galaxy. The sovereignty had not recorded it in any significant way, but on Earth and in every human colony, it was something people knew. It was part of the texture of things, One of those pieces of history that you absorb without being formally taught it, because the people around you carry it and it passes through the air. The story was about the Vandry Plague. In 2291, a disease had moved through the human colonies. It had started on one of the outer stations and traveled faster than anyone expected, faster than the containment teams could move. Within 8 months, it had reached Earth itself. It was killing people across every continent. The hospitals could not keep up. The research labs were running around the clock and making no progress. The projections were terrible. The most cautious estimates said that without a solution within 2 years, 30% of the human population would be gone. The less cautious estimates were worse. The sovereignty had sent notes of sympathy. But while the great powers were writing their notes, a medical transmission arrived from an unexpected source. A data package, enormous, detailed, containing biological research that human science had not yet reached. Research on immune response systems that were structurally similar to human biology. Analysis of pathogen behavior that matched the Vandry Plague's pattern almost exactly. It had come from the Kelvori. Nobody had asked them. Nobody had known they were working on it. They had received word of the plague from their own long-range monitors, and some of their scientists had looked at the biology involved and recognized something, a pattern, a connection that they were equipped to address. So they had worked on it, quietly, without announcement, and when they had something useful, they had sent it. It cost them. The sovereignty had not been pleased. The Kelvori had acted outside the official channels. There had been political consequences, slow ones, quiet ones, the kind that show up as reduced trade agreements and less favorable treatment at council meetings. The Kelvori had accepted those consequences without complaint and without explanation. The research they sent had saved 70,000 lives in the first year alone. Over time, as the treatment was refined and applied, the full count was higher. The Kelvori had never once mentioned it again. They had not done it for recognition. They had not done it as a bargaining chip. They had done it because they could, and because someone needed help, and those were sufficient reasons. The human crews who boarded their ships in those 6 hours of gathering knew all of this, not as a formal briefing, as something they had grown up knowing. The Kelvori helped us when they did not have to. They asked for nothing. They remembered them when no one was watching. Now the Kelvori were calling into the dark, and everyone was ignoring them. Not everyone. Admiral HFY walked the length of the Unbroken Promise as it completed its final pre-jump checks. She walked the corridors the way she always did before a deployment, not inspecting exactly, just being present. She passed through the crew quarters, the medical bay, the tactical operations center, the engineering decks. She said a few words here and there. She did not give speeches. She did not rally people. The people on this ship did not need rallying. She stopped at the door to the engine room and looked in. Bram Osai was at his main console, running through his checks with the slow thoroughness that was his signature. His team moved around him efficiently and quietly. Everything looked exactly as it should. Osai looked up and saw her. He nodded once. She nodded back. That was enough. She made her way to the bridge. The bridge of the Unbroken Promise was a wide, low-lit space full of screens and quiet voices. The crew were at their stations. Everything had the feeling of coiled readiness, not tension, exactly. Readiness. The feeling of a tool that has been cared for and is ready to do its job. Solana was already at the tactical station. He had 6 screens open and was building a preliminary picture of the Kelvori system from the long-range data they had received. He had notes everywhere. He looked up when HFY came in, gave her a brief nod, and pointed at the largest screen. 340 Volkai ships, he said. Siege formation. They've been running this pattern for about 30 years. They like to come in heavy from one side and use mass to compress the target's defense line. He paused. It works on people who think the same way they do. HFY looked at the formation on the screen, and people who don't. Solano's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Different story. Dr. Hara arrived on the bridge with a data pad and a quiet expression. She had spent the last few hours going through everything she could find on the Kael'vori, their language, their social structures, their history. She had also gone through everything available on the Volcae, which was less about culture and more about pattern of destruction. The Kael'vori don't have a strong military tradition, she said, joining them at the tactical station. They're not built for this kind of fight. Their defense force is real but small. They'll be holding on, but they won't be holding on for long. How long? HFY asked. When we arrive, Hara calculated. Maybe hours, maybe less. HFY nodded. Then we move fast. She walked to the command chair at the center of the bridge and sat down. Around her, the crew completed their final checks. The fleet was assembled. The drives were ready. The coordinates were locked. She looked at the main screen, where the stars ahead of them were still and quiet. The destination just a point of light among thousands of other points of light. "Admiral," said the navigation officer, "fleet is ready for jump." HFY took one breath, one slow, even breath. "Take us out," she said. The unbroken promise moved. Behind it, one by one, 486 other ships followed. The drives ignited in sequence, and the fleet swept forward into the jump corridor, vanishing from normal space in a long, bright line that lasted 3 seconds and then was gone. The solar system went quiet again. On the screens of the Sovereignty's monitoring stations, the departure was logged as an unusual military movement from a minor species, notable but not urgent. Someone would file a report. Someone else would read it later. But the fleet was already gone. And somewhere ahead, in the amber-lit star system of Kael'vori Prime, the Volcae ships were moving into their final assault positions, and their general stood on his bridge with his hands behind his back and looked at the planet below him, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has done this many times and expects to do it many times more. He had no idea what was coming. Nobody did. Except, perhaps, an old Kael'vori elder who stood at a broken window and looked up at the stars and thought about a signal he had sent, and a ping that had come back in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He had not told anyone about it. He was keeping it quietly, the way you keep something fragile, holding it carefully so it did not break before it had the chance to become real. The night outside was dark. The moons were high. The Volcae ships were visible now with the naked eye, bright moving points of light against the stars, drawing closer with every passing minute. Sathrek watched them come, and he waited. The last hour before the bombardment was the quietest hour. On the surface of Kael'vori Prime, the capital had gone mostly dark. Not a blackout, the power was still on in the shelters, still running the medical stations and the communication arrays, but the streets were empty, the market squares were empty, the long river walks that the Kael'vori loved in the evenings were empty. The city felt like a held breath. General Veth stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Volcae warship Sovereign Fist, and looked at the planet below him through the wide front viewport. He was a large being. Volcae were large in general, broad, heavily built, with dark armored skin that had evolved on a high-gravity world and never quite let go of the thickness that world had demanded. Draal was older than most of his officers, and the years had not made him soft. They had made him precise. He had been running military campaigns for 22 years. He had participated in the conquest of 6 civilizations personally. He knew how these things went. He knew the rhythms of them, the resistance that starts strong and then slowly exhausts itself. The moment when the defending forces realize they cannot win and begin to collapse. The long, careful process of turning a living civilization into a controlled territory. He found the process almost boring now. Not because it was easy. It was always difficult in the details, but it was predictable. Every civilization responded to overwhelming force in the same basic ways. They fought. They ran. They asked for help. Help did not come. They fought some more. Eventually, they stopped. Kelvori had been in the fighting stage. Now they were moving toward the asking for help stage. Draal had seen their distress signal go out. He had monitored the galaxy's response with something approaching amusement. The Threnai sent a note. The Asavari sent a longer note. Nobody moved. This was the part he had always found most useful, the moment when the defending civilization realized that the rest of the galaxy was not going to save them. That moment did more to break resistance than any weapon. He turned to his communications officer. Begin the final approach sequence. I want bombardment of the northern defense installation started within the hour. Yes, General. He turned back to the viewport. Below him, Kelvori Prime glowed amber and green in the light of its sun, quiet and small and entirely surrounded. It was going to be a short day. The first sign was on the long-range sensors. One of the Voakai sensor operators noticed it first, a fluctuation at the edge of the system's detection range. He almost dismissed it. Sensor fluctuations happened. Space was full of things that showed up briefly and then resolved into something normal. He flagged it as routine and moved on. Then the fluctuation happened again. And again. And then it stopped being a fluctuation and became a reading. 1 ship, then 5, then 20. Then the readings were coming in so fast that the system was struggling to count them individually and was starting to group them. The sensor operator stared at his screen. He checked his calibration. He ran a diagnostic. Everything was working correctly. He looked at the screen again. He picked up his communication line and called the bridge. Draal was still at the viewport when the call came through. He listened. He did not move for a moment. Then he turned around and walked to the sensor station himself. He looked at the screen. He watched the numbers resolving. He said nothing. The numbers kept climbing. They were past 100 now, past 150. The sensor system had finished its grouping calculation and was now displaying a single consolidated number at the top of the screen, updating every few seconds as new ships dropped out of jump. Past 200, past 300, past 400. Draal's sensor officer turned to look at him. The young officer's face was carefully controlled, but his hands had tightened on the edge of his console. General, he said quietly, 487 signatures, unknown configuration, moving into combat formation. Draal looked at the number. Then he looked at the formation the ships were taking, which the sensor overlay was beginning to map in basic geometry. It was not a defensive arc. He recognized defensive arcs. He had broken through dozens of them. Defensive arcs were what you used when you were trying to protect something. This was not a defensive arc. He knew what a hunting formation looked like too. This was that. Identification, he said. The communications officer ran the query. The answer came back in a few seconds. UES Unbroken Promise, she read. Leading vessel, United Earth Defense Command. She paused. The rest of the fleet is also registering as Earth vessels, General. Draal said the word slowly, Earth. Yes, General. He knew the name. He had a general awareness of most spacefaring civilizations in this part of the galaxy. It was useful information for a man in his position. He pulled what he knew about Earth from memory. Young species, 80 years of serious spaceflight, small presence. No major conflicts on record outside their own system, not sovereignty members in full standing. By any measure, a minor player. He looked at the 487 ships, currently arranging themselves between him and Kelvori Prime. He opened the communication channel himself. He did not usually do this. It was below his rank to speak directly to opposing forces, but he was curious. Earth vessel, he said. This system is under Voakai Dominion authority. You are in a declared military zone. Identify your purpose and withdraw immediately. A brief pause. Then a woman's voice came back, calm, clear, not aggressive. Just matter-of-fact in the way that people are matter-of-fact when they have already decided what they are doing and do not particularly need to explain themselves. This is Admiral Seraphine Akafer, United Earth Defense Command. We're here because someone asked for help. A pause that lasted exactly the right amount of time. You have 20 minutes to begin your withdrawal. After that, we will teach you what 80 years of war looks like. Draal stared at the communications console. Around him, his officers were very quiet. He had been threatened before, many times, by species that had large fleets and long histories of conflict and real military muscle behind the words. He had assessed those threats and decided which ones were real and which ones were posturing. He looked at 487 ships in a hunting formation. He thought about the 20 minutes. He had 12 civilizations behind him, 12 conquered worlds. He had not gotten to 12 by being careless with risk assessments. He looked at the formation again. He looked at the way those ships were arranged, not just the numbers, but the geometry. It was not a formation he had seen before. It did not follow any of the tactical patterns his databases contained for known spacefaring civilizations. It was something else, something that had been built from a different set of assumptions about how a fight should be structured. He did not like that. "Hold position," he said to his fleet. "Do not begin bombardment." He was not withdrawing, but he was not starting yet either. He was watching. On the unbroken promise, the 20 minutes passed in near silence. Akafer sat in her command chair. Solano stood at his tactical station with 6 screens active, watching the Volkai fleet's position updates in real time. Dr. Hara was at the communications desk, monitoring all channels. Bram Osai's voice came through on the internal line periodically with quiet engine status updates, each one the same, all systems ready. At minute 19, Solano looked up from his screens. "They're not moving," he said. "I know," Akafer said. "They think we're bluffing." "I know," she said again. The 21st minute arrived. "All fleet," Akafer said into the open channel, "execute pattern Solano 7, now." What happened next was something that Volkai sensor operators would try to describe in reports for years afterward, and never quite managed to capture correctly. The Earth fleet did not charge forward. It did not form a wall and push. It did not do any of the things that a large fleet, by conventional doctrine, was supposed to do. It split, not into 2 parts, into 11 distinct groups of ships, each one moving in a different direction at the same moment, spreading outward from their original formation position like the fingers of a hand opening. The groups moved faster than the Volkai expected, because the Earth ships had engines built for rapid acceleration rather than sustained top speed, a design choice that made no sense until suddenly it made all the sense in the world. The Volkai fleet was large and it was powerful, and it was built for the kind of combat that most civilizations fought. 2 forces meeting head-on, mass versus mass, power against power, the heavier side eventually winning. Draal had won 12 times doing exactly that. His fleet knew how to fight that fight in their sleep. They did not know how to fight this fight. The 11 groups curved around the Volkai formation from multiple directions simultaneously. 3 of them went high above the orbital plane. 2 went deep below. The others came in from angles that the Volkai's defensive coverage had not been designed to address, because no enemy in 12 campaigns had ever moved like this. Draal's ships tried to reorient. He was fast. He was a good commander, genuinely, and he began issuing orders to split his own fleet in response. But his ships were built to hold formation, to move as a single massive fist, and breaking them into smaller groups went against everything their construction and their doctrine were designed for. The first strikes hit from 3 directions at the same moment. The Volkai had strong shields. Their armor plating was among the best in the sector. They were built to take punishment and keep functioning, But the Earth fleet did not hit them in the places their armor was strongest. The ships had been watching for 30 seconds, scanning, mapping, looking, and when they struck at the specific points where the Volkai design left gaps. Not obvious gaps, small ones. The kind that only mattered when you knew exactly where to aim. On the Kael'Vori surface, Elder Sathrek was watching from the communications tower. The tower's exterior screens showed a rough sensor map of the space above the planet. It was not a perfect picture. The Kael'Vori's sensor equipment was limited, but it showed the broad shapes of what was happening. He could see the large mass of the Volkai fleet. He could see the smaller, faster shapes of the Earth ships moving around it like water moving around a stone, not hitting it straight on, but finding every crack and flowing into it. The young soldier who had been assigned to